continue now at the top of Daf Yomi Mesechet Shekalim. This is Shekalim Daf 12b. The Gemara in the previous Amud, Rabbi Yochanan had said that when it comes to Kodshe Berek Habayis, they can be redeemed even in a situation where they're Tamimim, even if they have no blemish, you're still able to redeem them, and they go to Chulin. And the Gemara had brought a proof from a Mishnah in Tamura which seemed to say exactly that. And the Gemara now says it's not necessarily a proof from Tamura. Rav Chizkiya b'shem Rav Chisda. Rav Chizkiya says in the name of Rav Chisda, Tifter, you can understand the Mishnah over there, Shepadon Tamimin v'humamu. The case is very simple. We're talking about a situation where originally they are Tamimim, originally they do not have a blemish, but then they get a blemish, so really you're redeeming them and they go l'chulin after the blemish. There's no proof again that Kodshe Berek Habayis can be redeemed before they get a mum. And the Gemara now says, Rabbi Yosa b'shem Rav Chisda masnisin amrakain. Rabbi Yosa says in the name of Rav Chisda that actually the Mishnah proves that. Why? Because what does the Mishnah say? The Mishnah over there in Tzmura says, Valdan v'chelban oser la'achar pidyonan. It's talking there about the Kodshe Mizbeach, and it says by Kodshe Mizbeach, even after you redeem it, the babies and the milk, that's all going to be oser after you redeem it. Now by Kodshe Mizbeach, certainly the redemption took place after there was a mum. So therefore you see that entire Mishnah is talking about after a mum. You can assume by Kodshe Berek Habayis as well, the Mishnah means that you're redeeming it after there was a mum. The Gemara continues, Rabbi Chizkiya b'shem Rabbi Yosa. Rabbi Chizkiya says in the name of Rabbi Yosa, Kodshe Berek Habayis shepadan tamimin yatzu l'chulin. Says the same thing as Rabbi Yochanan said on the previous Amud, that if you have Kodshe Berek Habayis and you redeem them when they're tamimim, when they don't have a mum, you can do that, and it goes l'chulin, and it is an effective redemption. And the Gemara continues, in Tamar lo yatzu l'chulin, because if you said they didn't go l'chulin, heich Kodshe Mizbeach cholin al Kodshe Berek Habayis. How would you ever have a situation where Kodshe Mizbeach is chal on Kodshe Berek Habayis? The Gemara here is referring to our Mishnah. Our Mishnah said that if a person is makdish all of his nechasim, so then what do you do with the males? You sell the male animals as olos. That's what Rabbi Eliezer said in the Mishnah. Now what that basically means is you're taking these animals which were originally made as Kodshe Berek Habayis, and they're suddenly transferring to Kodshe Mizbeach. How is that possible? Elamai, it must be that there's a redemption process possible by Kodshe Berek Habayis even without a mum. So too, you can redeem Kodshe Berek Habayis, and it goes l'chulin even if there's no mum. And the Gemara continues, Ba'alei mum, and let's say a person is makdish an animal that has a mum, Kodshe Mizbeach cholo alein. That can become Kodshe Mizbeach. Even though it has a mum, it still has the kedusha of Kodshe Mizbeach as if it were going to be brought as a carbon. So the Gemara asks, La'ida mila, so what, as far as what does it have kedusha as Kodshe Mizbeach? You can't bring it as a carbon, it has a mum. So what is the nafkamina? So the Gemara answers, Legiza uli avoda. The nafkamina is in terms of shearing the animal and in terms of working the animal. The halach is by Kodshe Mizbeach. When Kodshe Mizbeach get a mum, so then when you redeem them, even though they redeem them, they go l'chulin, they're still also begiza v'avoda. So the same thing is going to be true over here. It's going to be considered like it has kedushas Kodshe Mizbeach, and we're going to say that it's also begiza v'avoda after you redeem it. And the Gemara continues, Hifrish nekeva la'olaso lepischo la'ashamo. Let's say somebody's makdish an animal that is a female animal, and he does that either for a carbon ola, or for his carbon pesach, or for his carbon asham. So in all of these cases, a nekeva is not kosher to be any of these karbonos. And nevertheless, even though this type of animal is not kosher as this carbon, oset tamura, the halach of tamura still applies on this animal, meaning the kedusha is chal as far as the halach of tamura. So, for example, if a person would go to another animal and say, tehei zu, tamura zu, I want this to be exchanged for that, the halacha would follow the normal halacha of tamura, and we would say that that second animal would become kadosh. So that's the opinion of the Tanakama, meaning again, there is kedusha in all three of these cases, whether it's an ola, a carbon pesach, or a carbon asham. Rabbi Shimon says, la'olaso osa tamura. When it comes to a carbon ola, that actually can make a tamura. There's some kedusha there. Lepischo v'la'ashamo eno osa tamura. When it comes to carbon pesach, when it comes to carbon asham, that is not the case. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon, and now Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda says in the name of Rabbi Shimon. So this is a second opinion of Rabbi Shimon. There was the Tanakama of Rabbi Shimon's opinion, and now there's Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda of Rabbi Shimon. He says as follows: La'olaso ula pischo ula ashamo. Doesn't matter if it's a carbon ola, carbon pesach, carbon asham. Eino osa tamura. There's no kedusha whatsoever. There's no tamura. Now the Gemara tries to explain the Shittas. Amar Rabbi Yochanan says, Time of the Rabbi Shimon. What's the reason of Rabbi Shimon? Why does he make a distinction between a carbon ola and a carbon pesach and a carbon asham? This again is the Tanakama within Rabbi Shimon. Why does he make a distinction? Shekain matzinu nikeva ba'of kashera lava ola. Because you do find a situation of a female animal that can be brought as a carbon ola, and that's by an oaf, that's by a bird. So since at least you have some case where you can have a nikeva as a carbon ola, so carbon ola is different by carbon ola as well. When you're not talking about a bird, there's going to be some kedusha. V'yomer Rabbi Yochanan, and Rabbi Yochanan says further, again explaining the various shittas. Time of Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda, the reason of Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda is as follows: Im min b'minohu cholok olav. If Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda already holds when you have the correct animal, that's min b'mino. In other words, you designate the carbon from the correct type of animal, but you make a different kind of mistake in terms of the age of the animal. Even over there, if Shimon ben Yehuda says there's no kedusha, so kol shekein min b'she'eno mino. Certainly in a situation when you take the wrong kind of animal, in this case a female animal, there's going to be no kedusha. And the Gemara elaborates on that. Ezo min b'mino. What do we mean when we say min b'mino? Shehu cholok olav, where we say that Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda disagrees. Kahada detani, it's like the following thing that was taught. Asham ben shana, v'hevi ben shtayim, v'hevi ben shalosh. She had an asham, should have been a year-old. You brought a 2-year-old, should have been a 2-year-old. Instead, you brought a 3-year-old. These are different examples. For example, a ben shana would be an asham nazir, an asham mitzora. Then you have a situation of a ben shtayim, that's like an asham gazelos, or me'ilos, or a shivcha charufa. But whatever the case is, you were supposed to bring one age, and you brought the wrong age. Halacha is lo yotza, so you're not yotze. We'll take a look at the gra over here. The gra is a slightly different girsa. Kosher, the halacha is, it is kosher, but it doesn't fulfill the obligation required of the bailam to bring the carbon. In other words, it's a kosher carbon, but the bailam still need to bring another carbon properly in order to fulfill the obligation. And Rabbi Shimon says, there's no kedusha whatsoever, and that's exactly the case we're looking for. Here's the case where you bring an animal the wrong age, and again, what does Rabbi Shimon say over here? It doesn't work. That's exactly the position of Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda. That's what he's saying. If min b'mino is a problem, for sure min b'sheino mino is going to be a problem. The Gemara continues, Amar Rabbi Yochanan says, Rabbi Shimon v'Rabbi Yoshua shneim amru davar echad. Rabbi Shimon that we just said above, again, Rabbi Shimon said, if you're makdish and a keva as a carbon ola, there's no kedusha whatsoever. And Rabbi Yoshua in our Mishnah actually holds the exact same thing. Rabbi Yoshua in our Mishnah again was the shita that said that if a person is makdish all of his property, so the animals that are fit for the mizbeach, we assume kedushas ha-mizbeach. We assume that the person intended to bring those as a carbon. So Rabbi Yoshua said the males can be brought as carbonola, but the females, since they cannot be brought as a carbonola, we're assuming your intention was carbonola, which is kula la Hashem. So he said, since the females can't be brought as a carbonola, they're sold on the market as a carbon shlamim, and then you use the money for carbonola. So what do you see? So the Gemara explains, Kimad Rabbi Yoshua Amar Nekeva La'ola Lo Kitsha. Apparently Rabbi Yoshua held there's no real kedushas ola in the nekeva. It doesn't have the kedusha of a carbonola, even though that was your intention. Ella hektish damim. The only extent of the kedusha is hektish damim, meaning you're going to sell it for its value, and then you're going to use the money to buy a carbonola. There's kedusha in terms of its value, in terms of its worth. So Kain Rabbi Shimon Amar Nekeva La'ola Lo Kitsha. Ella hektish damim. That's exactly what Rabbi Shimon is saying. Rabbi Shimon says if you're makdish in a cave as a carbonola, there's no kedusha whatsoever. It's just hektish damim. It's just hektish in terms of its value. In Tamar kadsha kedusha saguf, and the Gemara says if Rabbi Yoshua would have held that there's some kind of kedusha saguf over here, that the nekevas also have kedushas ola, so then the halacha should have been yiru. Then the halacha should be that you let them graze until they develop a mum, and then you would redeem it. But that's not what Rabbi Yoshua said. Rabbi Yoshua said you just sell it and you use the money for carbonola. So you see there's no kedushas ola in the animal. It's really just a kedushas damim. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rebbe says, and we're going to go with the gears of the carbonaid over here. Ein ani roes divrei Rabbi Shimon b'Pesach. I do not agree with Rabbi Shimon's position when it comes to carbon Pesach. Again, Rabbi Shimon said if a person is makdish in a keva for carbon Pesach, there's going to be no kedusha. Rebbe's saying I hold there is kedusha. Why? Shamos or Pesach b'shlamim, because the halach is if you have extra carbon Pesach, you don't need to use as carbon Pesach. You just bring it as a shlamim, and a shlamim can be in the keva. So since essentially carbon Pesach can be equivalent to a carbon shlamim, and a shlamim can be in the keva, so therefore I say there is kedusha when a person is makdish a nekeva as a carbon Pesach. So the Gemara says, according to that logic, if you're going to use the logic of Moser, so then then you should say the same thing by Karban Asham. You should say, I don't agree with Rabbi Shimon when it comes to Karban Asham. Why not? Because by Asham as well. Shaham Moser Asham Ba'ola, because the halacha is the extra from a Karban Asham is brought as a Karban Ola. It's exactly the same. Now we know again, a Karban Ola by Karban Ola, Rabbi Shimon admitted there was some Kedusha, according to the Tanakama's position. Within Rabbi Shimon, a Karban Ola did have some Kedusha, even if it was in a Keva. And since the halacha is the Moser of a Karban Asham is brought as a Karban Ola, so that should be exactly the same. It's exactly the same halacha. So the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Av, and Rabbi Avin says it's not comparable. Im Hikdash Pesach ba Shlamim Gufo Karav Shlamim. The difference is very simple. When a person is Makdash a Karban Pesach and we say that's brought as a Shlamim, that exact animal is brought as a Karban Shlamim. However, that's not exactly the case when it comes to an Asham. Im Hikdash Asham Ba'ola. But when we talk about the fact that if a person is Makdash an Asham and then he has extra, he doesn't need to use it as a Karban Asham, so it's brought as an Ola, Ein Gufa Karav Ola. Its body is not brought as a Karban Ola, meaning you don't bring that actual animal as a Karban Ola. What you do instead is you wait for it to develop a mum and you use its value. After it develops a mum, now you use its value to bring a Karban Ola. That's completely different. The Gemara concludes as follows: Mahu Kedon. What exactly is the yesod of the machlokas between the Tanakama and Rabbi Shimon? Because again, the Tanakama said it doesn't matter. By all of the karbanos, we say that if you're makdish the nekeva, whether it be the Karban Pesach, Karban Ola, Karban Asham, it's always going to have kedusha. Why does the Tanakama say that? And Rabbi Shimon disagrees. So the Gemara explains as follows: Hahein Amar Hekdish Damim Kadosh. According to Rabbi Shimon, so he says there's only or Hikdish. There's only kedushas damim. In other words, if you take a nekeva which isn't fit to be the proper carbon, the only kedusha that's chal is basically the kedushas damim. The value of it is kadosh. However, the Tanakama disagrees. He says as follows: Hikdish gufo hikdish, that when a person makes it hekdish, even the guf of the animal itself, even though it's a type of animal that's not fit for that type of carbon, there is some kind of kedusha. And again, as the Tanakama said, for example, the halach of tzmura would apply in such a case. And the Gemara continues at the two dots: Rabbi Zira b'shem Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. Rabbi Zira says in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, Taimud Rabbi Yoshua. What's the reason of Rabbi Yoshua in our Mishnah? Again, Rabbi Yoshua in our Mishnah assumed when your person is makdish his property, so if there's animals there, you assume that the person intends on bringing them as Karban Ola. Since the roy for the Mizbeach, we assume it's Karban Ola. That's why, again, the males are brought directly as Karban Olos, and the nekevos are sold, and the money is used for Karban Olos. So where does he get this idea? Pasuk says, "Daber al Aaron v'elbana v'el bnei Yisrael v'yamarta aleim ish mi beis Yisrael v'gomer asher yakriv la'Hashem liola." Pasuk basically lists off all of these different things that are brought as an ola, and we darshan hakol karev ola. All of it is brought, or akol karev la'ola. Everything is intended, everything is brought as a Karban Ola. In other words, if a person is makdish things stam, we assume that it's going to be an Ola. That's what we learn out from this particular pasuk. So the Gemara says, 1 second. L'ritzonchem tamim zachar. It says in the pasuk tamim zachar. It says a male. So minayin afilo nekevas. Where does he get that even females? In other words, if you're looking at the words of the pasuk, it sounds like if a person is makdish males, you assume it's a Karban Ola. But if a person is makdish females, why should you make that assumption? Talmud lomar babakar l'rabos es nekevos. So the Gemara answers, the pasuk says babakar. It's an extra word. It includes even nekevos. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yitzchak bei Rabbi Elazar Shal, Rabbi Yitzchak in the house of Rabbi Eliezer asked the following question: Ksiv zachar v'yat amid babakar l'rabos es nekevos. It says in the pasuk the word zachar, and you're telling me that the word babakar comes to include nekevos. With the chavasis, according to that logic, ksiv tamim, the pasuk also says tamim, meaning the animals don't have a blemish. V'yat amid babakar l'rabos bali mumin. So we should say the same thing. We should say babakar in order to include an animal that has a mum, because you should say, even though it says that the animal does not have a mum, even if a person is makdish an animal that has a mum, the kedusha should be chal. So the Gemara says, Ma beineon, what's the difference between those two drashas? In other words, why don't we say exactly that? Why don't we say the same drasha by a Baal Mum that we say by a Nekeva? And the Gemara says, Rav Amar Rav answers, Shivta dechad chida beinehen. The difference between them is, this is the wood that is used to separate between the various threads that the weavers used to use, meaning there's a clear distinction between one who is makdish nekevos and one who is makdish balei mumin, and the distinction is obvious. The distinction is that at least females are roy to go on onto Mizbeach as different types of karbonos. Maybe you can't bring a nekeva as a karbonola, but you can bring a nekeva as a different type of carbon. When it comes to an animal that has a mum, there's no kind of animal which has a mum which can be brought as a carbon, and therefore in that case it's obvious that there's no kedusha at all. And the Gemara continues at the two dots, quoting the Mishnah, Rabbi Eliezer Omer Yimachru v'chulu amin. Case over there was a person again is makdish all of his property. Among the property was wine, oil, and birds. One of the cases was ophos. So it says you sell the ophos for whatever they can be used for, and then you use the money to bring karbonola. So the question the Gemara here is going to ask is, the bird itself is fit to be a karbonola. Why are you selling the bird in order to get the money and use the money to bring a karbonola? Just bring the bird itself as a karbonola. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Avo b'shem Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, Talmud Rabbi Lazar. The reason of Rabbi Lazar is as follows: Daber al Aaron ve'elbona v'gomer asher yakrivu la'Hashem liola. Again, that's the same pasuk we used before to say that all these animals are fit for ola. Hakol karevola. Everything is brought as a karbonola. L'rtzonchem tamim zachar, and it says again l'rtzonchem tamim zachar. So I might have thought yachol afilu ophos. I might have thought that the same should be true by the ophos as well. Like in our case, you should bring the ophos themselves as a karbonola. Talmud lomar babakar, but the pasuk, this very pasuk says babakar, by the cattle, velo ophos. It means to exclude the ophos. By the ophos, you don't bring the birds themselves as a karbonola. Again, rather what you do is you sell the ophos and you use the money to bring a karbonola. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yirmiyah and Rabbi Bon Bar Chia have Yasvin v'Amrin. So Rabbi Yirmiyah and Rabbi Bon Bar Chia were sitting and they were discussing this, and they said as follows: Tamon Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Over there, just previously, Rabbi Yochanan was trying to explain Rabbi Shimon's position. Again, Rabbi Shimon's position was that if a person is makdish and a keva, a female la'ola, so Rabbi Shimon said that the kedusha is chal. Why? As Rabbi Yochanan explained, time of Rabbi Shimon shekein nekeva shaba'of keshera lava ola. The reason why the kedusha is chal on this female animal is because at least it's possible in general for a female to be a karbonola. An oaf, which is a female, can be a karbonola. So if Rabbi Yochanan went so far as to say that the kedusha is chal on an animal which is a female because of an oaf, and v'cho amar hachin, and over here we're saying totally the opposite. Here we have an actual oaf, and you're not bringing it as a karbonola. On the contrary, you're selling it and you're using the money for a karbonola. So that's very difficult, and we'll continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Yud Gimel Amud Aleph.